a new home, a fresh start, a quiet sanctuary, until she found the footprints, the unlatched gate, and the lingering presence of someone unseen. Stacey Eddington had no idea her dream house would come with uninvited guests and a battle for her own backyard. Stacey Eddington was a dedicated nurse in her late 30s who had long dreamed of owning her own home. After years of picking up extra shifts and saving every cent, she finally closed on a modest but charming 2-story house in the small sun-drenched town of Willow Bay. Positioned at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, the property boasted a cozy living area, a small vegetable garden, and, most importantly, an above-ground saltwater pool in the backyard. It wasn't luxurious by any millionaire's standards, but to Stacey, it was the most remarkable reward for her hard work. She found herself enamored by the early morning light that played across the shimmering water. It felt surreal sometimes, leaning on the wooden railing of her back deck, sipping coffee, watching the pool sparkle like a private oasis. For Stacey, who had spent the better part of her adult life living in cramped apartments and shared housing, this new level of privacy was almost spiritual. Her neighbors, at least initially, appeared friendly. Some stopped by to say hello on moving day. An elderly man across the street introduced himself as Mr. Leroy, kindly offering to help fix any minor household issues. A cheerful woman named Julia lived next door with her husband, who ran a local car repair service. There was even a gaggle of teenagers a few houses down, skateboard-wielding and full of energy, who waved to Stacey whenever she drove by. So far, so good, she thought. But the pleasant calm lasted only a couple of weeks. One scorching Saturday, Stacey had just finished an overnight shift at the hospital. Exhausted, she pulled into her driveway mid-afternoon. The oppressive heat practically shimmered in waves off the pavement. All she wanted was a cold shower, a quick snack, and then a nap, maybe capping off the evening with a relaxing float in the pool. However, as she parked her car, her gaze caught something odd. Her back gate was ajar. Frowning, she quietly walked around to investigate. Her heart thudded when she spotted damp footprints and a cluster of wet towels crumpled by the pool ladder. Empty soda cans and chip wrappers littered the deck. The water itself looked slightly lower, as though a group of people had recently splashed around in it. Her initial outrage gave way to disbelief. Who would be so bold as to sneak into a stranger's yard and use their pool? She shook her head, cleaned up the mess, and tried to tell herself it was just some kids messing around, maybe even by accident. Yet a tiny knot of unease lodged in her stomach, and she reinforced the latch on the gate before heading inside. As she collapsed onto her living room couch, the reality sank in. This might not be a one-time thing. While exhaustion tugged at her, Stacey's mind whirred with alarm. Memories of half-forgotten news clips about trespassing and liability danced before her eyes. What if someone got injured in her pool without her knowledge? And even if they walked away unharmed, the disrespect gnawed at her. She spent the next day off installing a new combination lock on the gate. For added security, she placed a small motion sensor camera just above the door leading to her deck. It wasn't a top-of-the-line system, but it was enough to alert her phone if someone was creeping around. A week passed in relative peace. Just as Stacey began to relax, she noticed a strange phenomenon. Some of her neighbors seemed more distant, giving her guarded or knowing glances. One afternoon, she was on her way to work when she saw the group of skateboarding teenagers whisper among themselves, shooting glances at her house. Surely they aren't the ones who snuck in, she mused, unsettled by how quickly suspicion sprang up in her mind. Later that evening, she mustered the courage to ask the kids, casually, if they'd seen anyone near her pool. Their awkward looks and lackluster replies left her unconvinced. One of them mumbled something about, It's too hot not to swim somewhere, which only fueled her suspicions. That same night, near midnight, her phone buzzed with an alert from the motion camera. Heart pounding, she clicked the app, only to see a flicker of movement near her fence. She rushed to her back window, but found no one in sight. Adrenaline surged, yet she felt strangely relieved that maybe she'd just caught shadows or a passing animal. Still, the tension in her stomach refused to ease. A few days rolled by without incident. Then, on one of her rare afternoons off, Stacy made herself an iced tea and settled onto her living room couch. The air conditioning hummed softly, and she let out a contented sigh, grateful for a moment of solitude. That peace was short-lived. Suddenly she heard the splash of water. No way, she thought, heart hammering. Setting down her drink, she approached the sliding glass door leading to the deck. Peeking through the blinds, she spied two teenagers, the same kids from the skateboarding group, boldly swimming in her pool without a care in the world. Rage and disbelief pounded in her temples. She unlatched the sliding door and stepped onto the deck. "Hey!" she barked, voice cracking with fury. The teens jerked around, eyes wide, and scrambled to climb out. One of them nearly slipped on the wet ladder. "We, thought it'd be okay," blurted the taller boy, water dripping from his hair onto the wooden deck. "Okay, you hopped a locked gate into my private property," Stacy spat, trying to keep her voice steady. "You didn't even ask permission." The shorter boy grabbed a towel from the deck chair. "We're sorry. We heard from some neighbors that you don't mind." Stacy blinked in shock. "Neighbors told you that?" "I absolutely mind. Now get out of here before I call the police." They dashed off, leaving trails of water behind them. Stacy's chest tightened with a potent mix of anger, violation, and confusion. Which neighbors told them it was fine? Or had the kids made that excuse up on the spot? What she did know was that this had gone from a strange annoyance to a full-blown problem. Stacy didn't want to be seen as the mean neighbor, but she also refused to be a pushover. The morning after catching the teens, she marched down to Julia's house next door. Julia opened the door, her eyebrows arching at Stacy's tense posture. "Are you aware that some kids have been sneaking into my pool?" Stacy demanded, frustration leaking into her tone. "They even said someone told them I wouldn't mind." Julia's eyes flickered with surprise. "No, I had no idea. Wow, I'm sorry to hear that." Although Julia seemed sincere, Stacy couldn't help but notice how, at the end of the conversation, she said, "But Stacy, I mean, it's just a pool, right? Teens around here get bored easily." Stacy struggled not to snap. "Just a pool? Julia, it's my private property, and if someone gets hurt, I'm liable. Plus, it's incredibly disrespectful." Julia nodded with mild sympathy. "I understand. I'm sure they didn't mean any harm." As she walked home, Stacy mulled over Julia's words. If even her friendliest neighbor was that dismissive, maybe others felt the same, or worse. The sense of entitlement from the community baffled her. She'd worked night shifts and holidays to afford this home. She had every right to keep strangers out of her pool. Stacy decided to install a more robust security camera system. She saved up some extra money from her overtime shifts, purchasing cameras that captured clear footage day and night. By the time everything was set up, nearly a month had passed since she first discovered Trespassers. Maybe the situation had blown over, she told herself, until she got a rude awakening. One weekend, Stacy took a short trip to visit her parents. They lived 2 hours away, and she craved a break from the tension in Willow Bay. Unfortunately, upon her return late Sunday night, she discovered an absolute nightmare in her backyard. Beer cans, half-eaten food, and plastic cups were scattered around like confetti. Her folding chairs had been rearranged, and the water in the pool looked murky, dotted with floating bits of trash. It looked as though an entire party had broken out in her absence. Feeling sick to her stomach, Stacy grabbed her phone and flicked through the camera footage. The recording showed at least a dozen people, teenagers and a few adults, laughing, swimming, and lounging in her yard. One clip captured a woman in her 40s that Stacy recognized from down the street. She'd never spoken more than a few words to her, yet here she was, using Stacy's pool like it was a neighborhood amenity. Stacy was livid. She spent the next 2 hours cleaning up the mess and deep cleaning the pool. By the time she finished, her arms ached and her eyes burned with angry tears. Why do they think this is okay? She had half a mind to call the police right then, but something in her gut told her she'd likely get brushed off with a warning for the trespassers, if the police even found them. As fatigue and fury battled for dominance, she knew one thing: she had to take drastic measures. On her next day off, Stacy began formulating a plan. She combed through various online forums, reading stories of how other homeowners dealt with persistent trespassers. One popular tactic was a harmless pool dye that turned the water a bright color if someone urinated in it. Another was placing ominous signs warning of chemical side effects. Stacy decided to try both. She drove to the hardware store first, buying the boldest "no trespassing" signs she could find. Then she added a few homemade ones that read, "Warning, pool under chemical treatment. Unauthorized use. May result in skin rashes, severe itching, and possible discoloration." She knew the disclaimers sounded a bit dramatic, but that was the point. Next, she purchased a large chain and a commercial-grade padlock for her gate, much stronger than the flimsy lock she'd been using. Her final stop was a specialty pool supply store. There, she picked up a bottle of invisible dye that would activate upon contact with urine. It wasn't actually dangerous, but it would stain the water a vivid green and cling to the culprit's skin for a short while. Even if it didn't end up working perfectly, the threat might be enough to scare people off. That evening, she meticulously set everything up. She hung multiple signs along the fence, replaced the old lock, and placed a fake but formidable-looking chemical drum near the pool pump. Exhausted yet satisfied, she stood back and surveyed her yard. The signs were visible from the street. Anyone trying to sneak in would be bombarded with warnings before they even touched the gate. The next day, Stacy's phone blew up with messages and calls. Word had spread quickly about her dangerous chemicals, fueled partly by the dramatic language of her signs. Neighbors posted frantic or accusatory messages in the community's social media group, claiming that Stacy was using highly toxic chemicals that might leach into the groundwater. Some condemned her for taking things too far, while others defended her right to protect her property. Julia texted her, sounding both concerned and a bit judgmental. "Hey, Stacy, are you sure about that chemical stuff? People are worried it might be harmful to pets or kids." Stacy took a calming breath before replying, "It's just a harmless dye, Julia. If they're that worried, maybe they shouldn't trespass in my yard. No one needs to touch it if they respect my property." She set her phone aside, ignoring the further stream of notifications. While she hated the idea of being painted as the villain, she reminded herself that she had tried to talk this out peacefully. It was the repeated trespassing and blatant disregard that had led her here. Despite the storm of online chatter, no one tried to breach her gate for about a week. Stacy felt a cautious sense of relief every time she scrolled through her camera feed and saw no suspicious activity. Then, one sweltering evening, a familiar face appeared at her doorstep. Mrs. Daniels, a middle-aged woman with 2 teenage sons who lived on the opposite side of the cul-de-sac. Stacy didn't know her well, but she recognized her as one of the participants from the infamous pool party footage. Mrs. Daniels knocked sharply, and when Stacy opened the door, The woman launched into a tirade, voice shrill with anger. "I've heard the rumors about your so-called chemical warfare on this neighborhood. You can't just threaten people with rashes and who knows what." Stacy held the door firmly, stepping outside so their conversation wouldn't spill into her living room. "Ma'am, no one is threatening anyone. I'm simply making sure unwanted guests stay out of my pool." Mrs. Daniels folded her arms. "You could be putting teenagers at risk. They're not always going to read signs." Stacy felt her anger simmer close to boiling. "And that's my fault? They need to learn respect for boundaries. Trespassing is illegal. I have every right to secure my property." "But it's mean," Mrs. Daniels blurted, grasping for an argument. "You're isolating yourself from this community." Stacy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I didn't isolate myself. The community did that when they ignored my rights and partied in my backyard. If you're worried about teenagers, then teach them to stay on their own property." Mrs. Daniels' nostrils flared. She opened her mouth to retort, then closed it again. Finally, she shook her head, turned on her heel, and stalked off. The rapid click of her sandals on the driveway echoed in the still evening air. Stacy watched her leave, heart hammering with residual anger. How long will this go on, she wondered. At least no one had trespassed again. Fear of the mysterious chemical seemed to be working. But the tension still weighed on her like a lead vest. In the following weeks, the scuttlebutt continued online. Some neighbors called Stacy a hazard and unfriendly, while others quietly applauded her actions for preventing the entire block from tramping through her property. Every time she went for a run or a grocery store trip, she sensed people whispering as she passed. Yet finally, the chaos showed signs of subsiding. With each passing day, the novelty of the drama wore off, and no one seemed keen to risk rashes or embarrassment by hopping Stacy's fence. One balmy afternoon, Mr. Leroy, the kindly elderly man across the street, waved her down. "I know there's been a lot of chatter," he said, his voice gentle but assured. "But you have every right to do what you've done, my dear. Some folks around here forget common courtesy." Touched by the support, Stacy smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Leroy. Means a lot to know someone sees my side." He patted her shoulder, squinting against the sun. "You're a good neighbor, Stacy. Don't let the busybodies keep you up at night." She realized how much the tension had weighed on her spirits. With Mr. Leroy's encouraging words, she found the resolve to weather any lingering hostility. Then, on a humid, late summer evening, she got another knock on the door, this time from Julia, the next-door neighbor who had initially seemed ambivalent. Julia looked tentative but offered a small smile. "Hey," she began. I wanted to say I'm sorry for how dismissive I was before. I get it now. People were seriously disrespecting your property, and you had to do something." Stacy inhaled, a tightness in her chest, easing. "Thank you, Julia. I appreciate that. I know some people think I overreacted." "Not me," Julia cut in, shaking her head. "Not anymore. Honestly, if they'd snuck into my backyard like that, I'd be livid too." They exchanged a few more words, and though their conversation was brief, it ended with a sense of genuine understanding. For the first time in a while, Stacy felt something akin to acceptance from at least one neighbor. In the end, it was surprisingly anticlimactic how the storm died down. Perhaps it was the start of a new school year that siphoned off the teenagers' free time. Perhaps the rumor mill simply found fresher drama, or maybe the signs, locks, and chemical hazard warnings left enough of a lasting impression that no one dared test Stacy's patience again. Whatever the reason, Stacy finally got what she wanted all along: peace. On her off days, She floated in her pool beneath the afternoon sun, or sometimes at night under the glow of string lights, free of worry that strangers might barge in. She sipped lemonade, lost in her own thoughts, letting the gentle slosh of water lull her into the relaxation she'd craved since buying the house. Of course, she still dealt with side eyes from a few neighbors, but by now she'd hardened herself against their opinions. She reminded herself of one crucial fact. This was her home. She had every right to protect it, and setting boundaries didn't make her cruel. It made her a person who valued respect and safety. Looking back, Stacy realized this ordeal taught her a valuable lesson. People often feel entitled if you don't vehemently defend what's yours. They'll shrug off your polite requests and disregard simple courtesy until you show them you're not to be trifled with. And yes, she might have gained a reputation as that neighbor, but if that was the price for keeping her sanctuary intact, she was more than willing to pay it. In the end, she had her solitude, her sparkling saltwater pool, and the knowledge that she could stand up for herself when pushed to the brink. And that, more than anything, was worth every wary glance and whispered rumor Willow Bay could throw her way. If you love gripping stories filled with mystery, suspense, and unexpected twists, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join us as we unravel more thrilling tales. Your next favorite story is just one click away.